In a previous video, we looked at the hover, active, and visited pseudo-selectors as a way to indicate interactivity with our HTML elements when a user hovers, clicks, or has visited a link or a button on a page. And as a refresher, we have our base styling applied to our links in our nav here, which set a border style and a color for the text. And then we have our hover styles, which set a different color, a new background color, and a different border. And that looks like this. Actually, let's go ahead and rerun this so we can get this without the transition that we're going to learn about here. And that looks like this. So if we hover over it, we get sort of a jump cut where the background color changes and the text color changes and the border shows up, and it just kind of snaps from one version to another. And this is fine. This still shows interactivity, but maybe we want to have a little bit of an animation on here so that these different properties ease into their new state as they change when we hover over them. For this, we're going to look to a CSS property called transition. And transition allows you to tell the browser to watch a specific CSS property, and as that CSS property changes, to transition from the initial state of that property over an animation state to the final display of that element. So let's look at how we do that. So we already know that we have these new styles here on our nav links that are showing up on hover. If I want to ease these from their base style to the hover style, I will go into my initial CSS declaration for that element, the class selector using the nav __ link class that we have on our HTML element. And within this base CSS rule, I'm going to add a property called transition. And transition takes 4 specific values. Transition is a shorthand. I will show you the longhand shortly, but you will almost always use transition as a shorthand. The first value that it takes is the property that we want to transition. So in our case, we're going to say background color. Then we add a space. The next is how long we want this transition to take place over. For the sake of demonstration, I'm going to use 1 second, so 1s. You would never really use a time that long, but it'll help us see the transition a little bit more. Then we can give a named transition timing function to our transition to say how we want the animation to sort of feel. We have a number of named values here. I'm going to use a simple one, which is ease-in. Now, these are the 3 properties that you need. Well, actually, to be fair, we only really need the property and the duration of the transition. If no transition timing function is supplied, the browser would default to one that is called ease, like that. So the 4th property that we could use is the transition delay. So if we wanted to wait a little bit before we apply this transition, we can add that as a 4th value here. So if I wanted to do half a second, I could do 0.5 seconds, and then it'll wait, the browser will wait half a second before it does the transition. So let's just start with these first 3. We'll transition the background color over the course of a second, and we'll use the ease-in transition timing function. So I'm going to save this, run it. So we'll wait for CodePen to reload here. And now you'll see when I hover over this, the text color changes immediately, but that background color takes about a second to fully go from no background to pink. Let's look at what this looks like with a transition delay. So let's put a 0.2 second transition delay in there. We'll save it and we'll run it. And now you'll notice when I hover over this, it doesn't immediately start to transition. It waits about 0.02 of a second before it starts to change. And that's in both directions. That's when I hover over it and when I hover off of it. Now, let's say you wanted to do multiple transitions. So you'll notice that the text and the border are changing immediately, but the background color is what is transitioning. We have a couple of different ways that we can approach this. The first and most performant way to do this is to have a comma-separated list of transitions that we're going to apply. So after my first transition, I can select color as the property I want to transition. I'm going to transition that over half a second. And let's take background color down to half a second too, so we have something a little more reasonable. And then I'm going to use a different transition timing function here, ease-out. So we'll save this, and we'll run it. And now, when we hover over it, you notice that we get the same transition effect on both the color of the text and the background color. So that's one way to do it. You can comma separate the list of properties that you want to transition within the transition property on the base CSS rule. It's important to note, and I want to reiterate this, that we're not putting the transition in the hover pseudo selector. We're doing it in the base selector for this element. So what if we had like a bunch of different things that we wanted to transition on this element? Like for instance, we're changing the border as well. Well, we could continue to add comma separated list of transitions, or we could use the all keyword in place of the properties that we want to animate. So we could say all 0.5 seconds, and then our transition timing function. We'll save it, run it, and then we'll see that all of our properties that are changing, including the border, are transitioning. Now, this is something that you can use on buttons, where you're changing things on buttons for hover. You can use this really when you're changing any element based on interactivity. You can add a transition to it and transition those values. There are things that you cannot transition. You cannot transition the display property, for example. So let's say, just as a let's try to illustrate this. I'm not sure that this will work, but let's just give it a shot. So we'll say display none, and then on hover, we'll say display inline. So we still have this transition here, but we're going from not existing to existing. So we'll save this, and we'll run it. And these items should not be there in the nav when the pen reloads. Okay, and they're not. And because they're not there, we can't even hover over them. They don't exist. They don't exist in what is called the DOM, the HTML document. So that's an example of something that you cannot transition. So I did mention that transition property is a shorthand. I'll show you the longhand just for the sake of demonstration. Let me just kind of put everything back the way that it was. Border 1px solid transparent. Okay, so if we wanted to write this out as longhand, the exact equivalent of this would be, so let's make this back into the transition or background color. So the longhand for this would be transition property, which is going to refer to the, we're going to put background color here. Transition duration, that's our middle value, so we'll say 0.5 seconds. And then transition timing function, we'll say ease in. Then lastly, if we were to have that fourth value here, the delay, the shorthand for that is transition delay. So these four property value combinations are functionally equivalent to this property value combination. However you want to do it, it's fine. It's the same thing. Ultimately, it's what works for you and what you find to be most legible. I personally use the shorthand, but if you find the longhand to be more legible, then by all means use that. So that's transitions. They can add like a nice layer of interactivity to your content and make it so you have a little bit more fun with the animations for your users who come to your site.